Welcome to today's webinar, Equity and Walkability, Improving Pedestrian Infrastructure in Underserved Neighborhoods, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in coordination with the Maryland Department of Transportation and our many Walkinar partners. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and host of the Walktober Walkinar series. Walking is an activity that many of us take for granted, but as pedestrian accident rates continue to rise and access to safe pedestrian space is diminished, communities are recognizing that walking and improving the walkability of our neighborhoods requires public attention and action. Throughout October, the Maryland Department of Transportation, in coordination with several state agencies and other partners, is sponsoring a series of webinars or walkinars to highlight how we can collectively rally around walking, an activity that is both central to the state's active transportation efforts and a critical component promoting public well-being. This is the second in a four-part series that we will host every Thursday morning this month. Thank you for joining us today and throughout the month. For more information about Walktober, please visit mdot.maryland.gov/Walktober or visit smartgrowth.org and click on the Walktober Walkinars link. We are recording this webinar and we'll be posting it online. All participants today will receive an email with a link to the recording once it is posted. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The Clearinghouse provides information to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. We encourage you to visit the website at smartgrowth.org and subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming programs. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speakers in this webinar are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association, as well as 1 Equity CM credit and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Equity and Walkability, Improving Pedestrian Infrastructure in Underserved Neighborhoods. You can also search for event number 925-8029. So today our speakers are Christina Yang, Anna Ziebarts, James Rojas, and John Camp. Christina Yang is the Technical Assistance Program Manager for 10-Minute Walk at the Trust for Public Land. She manages the campaign's technical assistance work, such as the Community of Practice, a forum that convenes 40 cities across the country to discuss and advance policies and practices that address park access, quality, and equity. She also supports the campaign's network of 30 cities, including working with mayor's offices and policy research and analysis for cities. Earlier in her career, Christina was at the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, a global organization using technical expertise, direct advocacy, and policy guidance to accelerate sustainable mobility efforts in the global South. Anna Ziebarts is a low-vision mother and non-driver who was born with the neurological condition nystagmus. Since launching the Disability Mobility Initiative at Disabilities Rights Washington in Washington State in 2020, Anna has worked to bring the voices of non-drivers to planning and policy-making tables. Through the DMI, Anna has built a non-driver story map, compiled the expertise in these stories in a groundbreaking research paper, and launched the #Week Without Driving challenge for elected leaders to understand what it's like to get around without driving themselves. Anna represents disabled non-drivers on the Washington State Active Transportation Council, the Autonomous Vehicle Work Group, and Transportation Demand Management Executive Board, and currently serves on the National Safety Council's Mobility Safety Advisory Group. Finally, James Rojas is an urban planner, community activist, educator, and artist who runs the planning, model building, and community outreach practice Placeit. Through Placeit, he has developed an interdisciplinary community healing, visioning, and outreach process that uses storytelling, objects, art production, and play to help improve the urban planning outreach process. His expertise includes model building as a means of community and planning outreach, working with underserved, disadvantaged communities and bringing overlooked voices to the planning discussion, making the physical form of cities relevant to broad audiences, and understanding how immigrants, especially Latino immigrants, see and understand urban and suburban space in the US and why they often reshape those forms in the ways they do. His partner in practice, John Camp, is an urban and landscape designer, facilitator, and licensed landscape contractor. Through his design practice, Prairie Form, John has more than a decade of experience in the design and installation of irrigation-free landscapes, the writing and illustrating of design guidelines, including the small lot design guidelines for the city of Los Angeles, work in urban tree canopy restoration, and improving neighborhood walkability. He is an experienced facilitator who leads workshops through Playset, has conducted trainings on water conservation and irrigation-free landscaping, and worked extensively with immigrant youth in the San Francisco Bay Area. Following their presentations, our presenters will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool located in the control panel on the right side of your screen. And today we're going to get started with a brief video from MDOT Secretary Jim Ports introducing today's Walktober Walkinar program.
Hello, I'm Jim Ports, Secretary for the Maryland Department of Transportation. Thank you for being here today as we celebrate Maryland's third annual Walktober, a month-long series of activities and educational events to promote safe walking and walkability. Following the successes of previous years, we're pleased to continue hosting a series of 4 webinars, or Walkinars as we call them, each Thursday throughout the month. These Walkinars highlight innovative practices to support walking and walkability and provide important information on safety, equity, health, and infrastructure. To learn more about Walktober and to find resources and events happening throughout the month, please visit our website. Today's Walkinar will focus on equity and walkability and how we can improve pedestrian infrastructure in underserved neighborhoods. We'll hear from Anna Zievarts, Director of Disability Mobility Initiative Program, Christina Zhang, Technical Assistance Program Manager for 10-Minute Walk at the Trust for Public Land, James Rojas from Placeit, and John Camp from Prairie Form. I'm excited for today's event. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the presentation.
Great, thanks, Jim. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Christina. Welcome, Christina.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and it is so wonderful to be here with my fellow panelists. Can someone just confirm that everyone can see my screen okay?
Yes, you are good.
Great, thank you. So as mentioned, I am Christina Zhang from 10-Minute Walk, and I'm really excited to share with you all the work that we do with our 300 cities across the country and how we are working to close the park equity divide in the US. So I would love for folks to just take a moment and think about how often do you walk to a park close to home? With Walktober upon us, envision a park nearby your house or your apartment, your place of dwelling. And if you feel encouraged to do so, I would love to hear how often do you go to this park? And in your mind, think of reasons why you go, but also why you don't go. What are the barriers, and also what are the images and sensations that immediately come to mind? So as you think on that more, I will just share a little bit of a background of our organization. The Trust for Public Land is a national nonprofit that works to protect land and create parks for people across the country. Our mission is to do this work to ensure healthy and livable communities for generations to come, and we believe everyone deserves access to parks and public lands. Specifically with 10-Minute Walk, our mission is to close the park equity gap in this country. 1 in 3 US residents do not have a park or green space within a 10-minute walk of home. And with that, we call on mayors and city leaders to accelerate the creation of parks that drive equitable, healthy, and thriving communities. So you can see here that we work with nearly 300 mayors, which represents about 57 million people. And in the state of Maryland, we work with about 6 cities and towns. For those who are interested in learning more of signing up their municipality to this network, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I would love to connect with you. And then here, I would love to just reiterate why we do this work. The importance of equitable park access is connected to our public health and our individual health. That is on our emotional, mental, and physical health level, as well as our community and social health. But we are also looking to reduce the environmental risks that exist through parks and green spaces, and that is cleaning our air, mitigating carbon emissions, protecting our lands through mitigating flooding, as well as cooling our lands with our increasing urban heat and heat islands that we see in our cities. There are also another multitude of opportunities that are available, such as economic development and workforce, as well as higher academic achievement as we are looking to work with public schools across the US specifically. In terms of the way we work with cities, on a high level, we target working with mayors and their commitments to providing close to home parks. And then for our city work, we have peer learning and networking, technical assistance to cities, policy recommendations, as well as working with our coalition of partners. Apologies, I'm just going to take one moment to switch my screen. I'm having an issue choosing the, okay, I see here. Okay, I hope folks are able to see my screen better. So in this next section here, I would love to focus on why I joined this panel today. So who is and isn't able to benefit from a city's park system, and how is walkability a factor? 100 million people in the US, which is 1 in 3 persons, including 28 million children, do not have access to parks within a 10-minute walk of home. Proximity is a priority and not a luxury, and this is how close to home parks play a critical role in improving well-being. From Smart Growth America's 2022 Dangerous by Design report, we have found we see how older adults and people walking in lower income neighborhoods were struck and killed at much higher rates than other populations in 2020, which is consistent with past years. Research also showed that persons of color, particularly Blacks and Native Americans, are also more likely to die walking than any other race or ethnic group. This lack of investment in sidewalks and the resulting poor street and road design in under-resourced communities result in precarious walking conditions for these groups and neighborhoods. And we also know of existing observed mobility patterns for low-income households. They have less time and money to spend on activities outside of work, such as leisure and recreation. This resulting disproportionate amount of time on commuting and traveling long distances really necessitates more opportunities for close to home activities, especially as we know these populations are more likely to trip chain. So for those who are the most dependent on walking, but also have the least amount of free time to access leisure and recreational opportunities, how does the park equity gap come into play? So we have been able to collect data across 100 largest cities in the US and have found that parks serving primarily low-income households are on average 4 times smaller than parks that serve a majority of high-income households. And then the park disparities across cities as we look at race and ethnic groups is also alarming. Parks serving a majority persons of color are on average half as large as parks that serve a majority white population, but they serve nearly 5 times more the population. The disparity in distribution of park acreage is most significant between predominantly white neighborhoods and neighborhoods where the majority of residents identify as Hispanic and Latinx. And here, depending on the metric, we see a different story. On the left, you see the 10-minute walk metric across 100 largest US cities, and seemingly persons of color are enjoying more access to parks and recreational opportunities of 77% relative to white populations with an access rate of 73%. But then when you look on the right for park acreage per capita, there's actually worse park access and the quality of the experience for residents in neighborhoods of color. 43% less park space compared to those who live in white neighborhoods. Here we can see a map of Baltimore just to demonstrate again the difference in the metrics. On the left, you can see that everyone is generally observing the same amount of access. To the right, where you can better understand where there's higher need for more park acreage, where in the center it seems to be the less need. But then what are the solutions and the strategies that we see across the country? There is model policy language and strategies that parks departments and departments of planning and transportation are using to ensure walkable and safe access to parks. So here, safe and enjoyable 10-minute walk or roll, a 20-minute bike ride, a 30-minute transit ride, but overall really emphasizing the need for safe and accessible, sustainable mobility options to parks and green spaces. And then here at TPL, we center community in everything that we do, especially as we are looking to improve the local walking conditions of a neighborhood. The way we do this is to ensure meaningful engagement by partnering and finding local organizations that are already doing this work and investing in them and bolstering their efforts. This also includes investing in local leaders, which are both formal and informal. And then lastly, having surveys and data and community meetings to really empower park users to identify and elevate their community needs and values. Apart from our community engagement strategies and the data that we have, another approach we use is to uncover and unlock underutilized spaces and transforming them into parks. Here you can see a schoolyard and a parking lot on top in front of a public school, and the way that we were able to transform it into a lively, green community amenity in New York City. Over 28 million children in America don't have a park within a 10-minute walk of home, and we are really advocating to look at the schoolyard space to provide that type of experience and amenity. Our analysis also reveals the striking differences in temperatures between communities that enjoy nearby parks and those who do not. TPL has found that areas within a 10-minute walk of a park can be as much as 6 degrees cooler than neighborhoods outside of that range. By providing green spaces in every neighborhood, we are hoping that communities can become more resilient to climate change, as parks are effective lands to absorb floodwater, and we are also encouraging to provide much needed tree shade in urban heat islands. So I just want to reiterate here, and there can be a link shared in the chat for our park serve. One of the most powerful tools that we have is our data. We have mapped across 14,000 cities and towns across the US, and please feel free to type in the municipality or city that you live in now. And we use this database to analyze the 10-minute walk serviceable areas for each park. This provides cities with demographic information as well as other key indicators such as the CDC health, mental health, and physical activity data urban heat, pollution exposure, and then a new tool that we have where we also identify public lands and schoolyards. The objective of this tool is to really help anyone visualize a city's park system and inform decisions by identifying areas that are most in need of a new park space. Having and using good data is crucial to making good decisions. So we are working with cities to pinpoint which neighborhoods will benefit the most from new parks. Even for cities with low 10-minute walk access and low quality indicators, this data helps city practitioners and leaders and citizens make the case to galvanize more support and resources for the areas that they live in and support. And then lastly, through our data and efforts and relationships with cities, we are able to measure park systems nationwide. Park Score is the gold standard comparison of park cities across the largest 100 US cities. Since we began tracking 10-minute walk access about a decade ago, we've seen a 15% increase in the number of people who live within a 10-minute walk of a park in the 100 largest cities. That's 6 million more people who now have access to the outdoors. That is great progress, but there's so much more that can be done hand in hand with communities and decision makers. So before we wrap up, I just want to thank Walktober for inviting us to be a partner. We have been celebrating National Walk to a Park Day all week because October 10th was another federal holiday. But with that, we always encourage people to post or walk to a park because we would love to amplify and share those stories within our own network as well. And then lastly, I just leave my contact information with you all here. Please don't hesitate to connect with me. And with that, I will hand it over to Anna.
Wonderful, thank you. This is Anna, and we're actually going to start with a video from my end. So I'm going to turn it over to the other folks who can roll that video.
When I had my brain bleed in California, I moved up here because that's where I have all my friends and family.
Jaime rolls along a cracked up sidewalk in Pasco.
But then you have sidewalks like this, which to me is an embarrassment.
Like where I'm standing is on grass, where a sidewalk is supposed to be.
Chris uses a white cane to walk along a muddy path to a Vancouver bus stop. Other disabled people navigate the mud and walk in the street.
So when it's rainy, like Washington often is, it gets really muddy and hard to walk, so you almost feel like you're safer walking on the edge of the road.
In Spokane, Alco uses a white cane to navigate along the edge of a suburban neighborhood street that doesn't have sidewalks.
My worry is somebody's really zipping hell-bent for election and I don't get out of the way in time, you know?
Cody Shane in Chewelah pushes a trike along a sidewalk that is missing sections and filled with gravel.
Without transportation, people with disabilities become isolated, and when we become isolated, we become depressed.
Originally, I moved out to Edmonds because that's what my roommates and I could afford.
Erica crosses a suburban Edmonds street in her power wheelchair.
It means taking an hour and a half, 2 hours to get anywhere that I need to go.
A person in a power wheelchair rolls over a cross street where the ramps are angled, so he has to go out into high-speed traffic. Another person, using a white cane, crosses a multi-lane road without crosswalks while a semi approaches.
We can't get across the street sometimes to get a bus or to get some food or some water because there's all these barriers in between.
Jamin in a manual wheelchair approaches an uneven, crumbling sidewalk in Port Orchard.
My trip to school takes me 2 hours.
Abby from Vancouver, holding a white cane and waiting at a bus stop, and then getting off a bus.
If I end up missing one of buses, it takes me around 3 hours.
Chris waits at the bus stop next to her apartment complex on Bainbridge.
I think buses and ground transportation should be something that is seen as anybody and everybody should use that.
A person in a manual wheelchair waiting at a crosswalk as a Pierce Transit bus drives past. Kat from Bremerton waits with her power wheelchair in the middle of the road for the bus. Her partner JR waits in the loose gravel with his service dog as the bus approaches.
I'd have all the sidewalks paved that are anywhere anybody can walk, including and especially bus stops.
Clayton rolls down the street with other young wheelchair users in the Friday Harbor 4th of July parade.
I'm looking forward to the day when we have some kind of transportation.
Cars speed past the tip of Zach's white cane as he stands on the edge of a busy rural road in Kingston.
You can make a lane wider for big trucks, or why can't you make a sidewalk for people who are traveling that don't have access to driving?
People like me shouldn't be an afterthought. Like, we are here, there's plenty of us, and we don't just want to stay cooped up in our houses because a curb cut is missing or there's roots growing and throwing off the sidewalk.
Tanisha rolls up to a missing curb ramp on her street in West Seattle. Another wheelchair user rolls over a giant crack in a sidewalk caused by a tree root.
And we don't want to be harassed in the street because that's our only option to be safer.
Tanisha weaves through the cars blocking the curb ramp as she tries to cross an intersection.
And those are things that are preventable, so we should prevent them.
Produced by the Disability Mobility Initiative.
All right. Well, thanks all. I hope you were able to hear the video. I know I was having trouble with it, and unfortunately, GoToWebinar doesn't allow captions to display, but we'll post the link to that in the chat, and you can check it out on your own if you weren't able to hear that. I'm going to go ahead and start screen sharing. And all right, just want to confirm you all can see my screen.
Yes, you're good to go, Anna.
Wonderful. All right. So yeah, that video highlighted some of the stories of the folks that I work with as part of the Disability Mobility Initiative, which is a program in Washington State that I launched back in the fall of 2020. And we are organizing non-drivers from throughout Washington State. But the work we do speaks more broadly to the access needs of non-drivers throughout the country. And I just want to talk a little bit about how many of us there are out there. We know that mobility in the US is largely defined by being able to drive yourself where you want to go in a private automobile. And for those of us who can't drive, people with disabilities, people who are too young to drive, people who are aging out of driving, immigrants, people who can't afford a car, people who don't have documentation for whatever reason, driving isn't an option or isn't a reliable option. And statistically, 31 out of every 100 residents in the US doesn't have a driver's license. And so we know that there's a lot of us out there. In Washington State, we're working on trying to define the number of non-drivers more specifically and understand a little bit more our demographics. And we're working right now with tool design. We got a study funded through the legislature last year to help us understand those numbers and understand who we are. But we know there's a lot of us out there. And our work with the Disability Mobility Initiative really is trying to bring up and highlight our stories so that we can achieve more equitable, more accessible communities where all of us can get around. This photo here on the right is Kat and JR, who you heard in the video, hopefully, who live in Bremerton, Washington. And this is a bus stop in Kitsap County that's loose gravel. And so when I was waiting with them for this bus stop, Kat was out in the middle of the street with her wheelchair because she couldn't pull off the side of the road. And it was actually pretty terrifying to wait there as cars were speeding by, and then the bus had to block both lanes of traffic for her to be able to get on. So we know that there are barriers everywhere for disabled folks and for anyone who doesn't have easy access to a vehicle. So our organizing work, you heard some of the stories of the folks who we've connected with in that video, but there's a lot more stories out there, and some of those stories are documented in our Transportation Access for Everyone story map, which to date, I think we've got around 240 interviews of non-drivers from every legislative district in the state. They feature a summary of the interview, some quotations, a photo, and I encourage you to check this out on your own time. And while these, this is Washington State, like the rest of the country, we have folks from urban areas, from suburban areas, from rural areas, and there are people who without access to driving everywhere. So I want to take a minute and just sort of highlight some of the things that we've learned through these interviews, some of the themes that have come up. And I think one of the biggest themes is the importance of pedestrian connectivity, which is why I'm here at this Walktober presentation, to highlight that need. I think when people think about transportation access for non-drivers, you sort of automatically think about transit or paratransit, but a real big missing piece of that is how do you get to that transit stop, and how do you get around your community, and is there that sidewalk connectivity? And Crystal Monteros is a advocate from Tacoma, Washington. This is a photo of her on the right at her bus stop next to her apartment complex. And it's, the bus stop itself has a cement platform, but there's no sidewalk that connects to it. And so it's sort of this muddy, gravelly patch that on a dry day is passable, on a wet or snowy day becomes not feasible for her to roll through in her wheelchair. And she said to me in an interview, we need to start thinking about public transportation and sidewalks as going together instead of as two separate things. You can't use the bus if you can't get yourself to a bus stop. And we hear this again and again. You heard Tanisha in the video talking a little bit about her challenges with transportation access in Seattle, where our sidewalks are pretty torn up. There's a lot of tree roots, there's a lot of cracks, there's a lot of uplifts, and then there's a lot of missing curb ramps. And so Tanisha ends up rolling in the street instead of being able to use the sidewalk network, which is a real safety issue for her. And also she gets a lot of harassment from drivers yelling at her that she shouldn't be in the street when that's really her only option. We also have challenges with roads that have prioritized car speed instead of access for pedestrians. And this is an example of a more rural community here in Washington State, where the state highway is the main street of this town, Chewelah. And Cody Shane is a non-driver who lives there, and he can't drive, but he bikes around town. But to get across the main street, to get from his house to the grocery store, his house to the library where he works, he's got to cross the state highway that has only one light in town, and the town's about a mile, and so he has to sort of go way out of his way and then scurry across the street really quickly. And so we see this not just in sort of more rural areas where highways are the main streets of town, but also in bigger areas like Seattle, for example. This is an example of a project we've been advocating for it's the intersection of Highway 90 and Rainier Avenue, which is one of the major north-south corridors in Seattle. And there's these unsignalized on-ramps that you have to cross if you're traveling on the city street. And this is a big transit corridor, one of the busiest transit corridors in the city. It's also a historically red-line neighborhood. And we are in the process of building a new light rail station right in the middle of this freeway. And so people using that light rail, transferring from the light rail to buses, will be needing to cross these unsignalized on-ramps. And for able-bodied pedestrians, it's unpleasant, it's scary. People have been hit. For disabled pedestrians, it can be straight out inaccessible, a complete barrier. I went out there and walked with Micah, who was one of my interns here on the right, and he walked up to this sign thinking it was a push button, an accessible pedestrian signal to get a light to cross. And it's just a sign that says you have to be careful as you sort of dash across the street. So we've been working with our state DOT and with advocates, with community organizations, and actually finally got a RAISE grant this last cycle to start to address some of these barriers. But we see that, that trade-off between speed and access everywhere in our communities. So I want to end by just highlighting the importance of interacting with, engaging with, and ultimately bringing disabled non-drivers and non-drivers more broadly into planning conversations, into your transportation departments, into the leadership of your transit agencies. These are some of the people that we work with the story map, who have shared their expertise and are working with us to transform the transportation system here in Washington State. And as people who day in and day out don't have access to driving, we spend a lot of time walking along the shoulders of highways, waiting at bus stops, thinking about how we could make our communities more walkable, more rollable, more accessible. And it's past time to sort of tap into that expertise and bring us in so that we can help shape more accessible, equitable communities and where everyone can get where they need to go. a shortcut for getting there in the meantime is the Week Without Driving Challenge, which I think was mentioned in my bio. And this is we've done it for 2 years now in a row. We just finished our second challenge, and we want elected leaders and other folks in leadership positions at transportation agencies and transit departments to have the chance to experience what it's like to get around without being able to drive themselves in a vehicle. And so we challenge them to do that for a week. And so they get a taste, and it's not really everything, but they get a taste of what are some of the barriers in their communities for people like me who can't drive, and people like the people we organize in the story map. And so we just wrapped up our second year, and we'll be doing this again next year. And you can check out some of the experiences from elected leaders who started to understand a bit, okay, wow, it really does limit your ability to get around when the bus stops running at 6 p.m. and you can't go to an evening event, or there's no sidewalk to connect to that bus, or you can't cross the street there safely, and has helped them understand the importance of investing in accessibility. So I will make sure to share my contact information in the chat, and encourage you to check out our work at dismobility.com. Thanks. And oh, great, I'm turning it over to our next presenters. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Anna. Can someone just confirm that they can see this and hear this?
Yes, you're good to go.
Great. All right. Well, we wanted to thank you guys for inviting us. We've been doing this work for a long time. We're going to talk about community engagement and how to equitably engage folks in walkability. So let me just very quickly. So James and I'm Prairie Farm. James is Place It, and we do about 80% of our work together. I'm going to whip through this presentation really quickly, so you're going to hear my voice, and then in the Q&A, we'll both be able to talk. But just for the sake of time, we're going to go through this really quickly. We also have a book that just came out, Dream Play Build. Some of you probably already read it or have it. If you don't, there'll be a discount code at the end. But what we're going to talk about today, like I said, is community engagement, and specifically engaging people through their hands and senses in community engagement for a more equitable and walkable world. So we'll talk about our backgrounds very briefly, and we're going to talk about the psychology of working with your hands and senses. We're going to talk about a few applications, just a couple actually, because we don't have a lot of time. And then, and then there'll be a Q&A at the end with everyone. So just very briefly, so James and I started doing our work in around 2005, 2006. This is a photo of us from way back when in downtown Los Angeles. He was working for Los Angeles Metro. I was working for the city of Los Angeles, and we were both really seeing how community engagement just wasn't working. On his end, there'd be these huge meetings for these massive rail projects, multi-million-dollar rail projects, and no one would say a word. And these were largely in Latino communities. This was with the Gold Line that was being planned at that time, and no one would say anything. In my case, working for the city of Los Angeles, it was almost the opposite problem, that we'd have the same cast of characters coming to every meeting and saying the same things, and then no one else would talk. So there was a group of people who would really dominate. And around that time, James started using these found objects to create these models and engage people in model building. And you can see this in the photo here. And slowly over time, we started using this in urban planning and discovered that this is a way to engage people through their hands and senses in planning and really bring out their own inner planners in them, designers, bring out their own creativity and really level the playing field so that everyone can be involved. And then we've added to the roster, and so we have things called sensory-based walking tours, weed walkabouts, so we do pop-up models, public space prototyping, all sorts of things. But the main objective of all of these is to engage people through their hands and senses, because then you really get everyone in, you bring everyone into the process. So I'm going to talk about the psychology of engaging people through their hands and senses, because I really want to ground this in the why, because a lot of people ask us why do you engage people through the hands and senses. So in general, why we do this is that it really levels the playing field and allows everyone to be a part of the process. And so a lot of this just has to do with brain activity. So this is to be very simplified, but the talking brain is the prefrontal cortex. And this is a part of our brains that really keeps us focused on ourselves. It's the selfish part of us. And typical community engagement really it centers on using language as a way to and for people to express themselves in a community engagement setting. And the problem is that this really fires up the selfish part of our brains, the survival obsessed part of our brains. This is why when people come to meetings, they typically say the same things and they tend to be really negative. So they say things like they want more parking, they want less traffic, and they definitely don't want this in the photo here. And the problem is then that this gives us the sense that that's all people care about. And it also favors a very particular kind of person in community meetings and in community engagement. So this is someone who's comfortable with public speaking, who doesn't care about conflict, they're not bothered by it, but that's not most people. Most people are actually very afraid of public speaking, and that's very normal. We don't like to be stared at, and when you're standing up in front of a crowd, what the fear that we feel, a lot of it has to do with the fact that we're being stared at. And when we lived out in the wild back in the day, when something was staring at you, it meant that it wanted to kill you. And they really attribute that to why we don't like public speaking today, because we just have so many eyes on us. Well, this guy in this photo obviously doesn't care about that, but most people aren't that way. And so then this skews the outcomes further, because then only a certain kind of person will end up speaking and then everyone else stays silent. So what we really aim to do and are trying to do is to get people out of this survival mode so they can be expansive with their thinking. And working with our hands is the way, and senses is the way that we do that. So we fire up a totally different part of our brains, not the executive office, not the survival obsessed part of our brains. And then we can sink into a state of play. So this is a kind of mental state we get in where we can play and also play with others. And so you can be aspirational, you can think about the future in a way that's not scary for you, and you can work with other people in a very normal and natural way. So when you work with your hands, your best self really comes out. And then we can tap into what our core values are, so transcend things like parking and traffic and no density, and move on to the things that we really care about, like walkability, like trees, like discovery, exploration, all these sensory aspects of where we live. We can tap into those by way of our hands and our senses. And then the biggest thing is that it really levels the playing field, so everyone can be a part of this. With the method that we use, one of the primary methods is engaging people through found objects. We have them build models of memories, and we have them build models of ideal places, walkable places, their dream city, dream neighborhood. None of this requires any sort of background in design. These aren't models that need to be to scale. So this is a perfect example in this photo here. You can see people of all backgrounds and ages working together to build a more walkable and rollable neighborhood. The cool thing too is that we can then tap into our own innate sensory knowledge of space. We're constantly taking in information subconsciously to kind of regulate our bodies and ourselves, so that we stay within a window of not too much newness and not too much sameness. And this is a way to really tap into that knowledge that we take in or we develop over time, our sensory knowledge. So a couple of project profiles just to give you guys a sense of some applications of this work. We do something called sensory-based walking tours. So we actually use walking as a tool for sparking people's creativity. So obviously we want people to be walking more. We want to be designing communities and neighborhoods that allow for people to walk more, but we also use walking in and of itself as a way to spark people's creativity. So an example of this is something we did in the Bay Area. It's called Exploring 63rd Street with Your Senses. And 63rd Street, it's a pretty long street. It runs through three cities, Oakland, Berkeley, and Emeryville. And it's not a super busy street. Its character changes quite a bit, so it kind of weaves in and out of different housing typologies, different building typologies, commercial housing, and so on and so forth. And it's the perfect street for a walking tour, because you don't have to contend with a lot of traffic, and you can just let your senses be your guide. So what we did is we had one group start at one end, and then we had one group start at the other end, and we had them walk towards each other. And we gave them these cards, and we said at the very beginning, we aren't going to be the guide, so James and I aren't going to be the guides. Your senses are going to be the guide. And if they wanted to note any sensory impressions that they had and where they experienced those, they could note them on this card. And then we just let things go where they were going to go. So you can see here some folks are pointing out an architectural detail. You can stop and feel the wind on your face. You can notice a smell, anything like that. So the experience is one of really moving in and out of wherever your senses lead you to. And what happens in the process is that you get into a sensing state, and that's the perfect space to be in for being creative. And so we converged on an art space in Berkeley, and then we had people build models of their ideal 63rd Street. I'm just going to show a video really quickly. So you can see. And the cool thing is that what people do then is they infuse their sensory impressions from the walk into their models, and they move beyond the kind of nuts and bolts things that we think of when we think about walkability, like crosswalks and stoplights and things like that, all of which are super important. But they can start to think really big, and so people think about things like verticality and tree houses, waterways down the middle of streets, making crosswalks fun, having music, all sorts of things. And that's really our objective here, is for people to allow them to be as expansive with their thinking as possible, because we really don't get an opportunity to do that very often. We're so constrained by various things in reality. And then what we did is we translated these into a virtual format during the pandemic. And we were actually approached by Habitat for Humanity in winter 2021, and they are doing a lot more work in urban planning, where they're trying to train people to be their own urban planners. And so we worked with a lower income neighborhood in West Long Beach. And one of the things that we did is we had them go to places that they love in their neighborhood and film themselves talking about why they love those places. So this is an example in this photo right here. This participant who's at her favorite place, which is a super wide sidewalk in her neighborhood. And there's this unsaid rule there that when you're walking down there, rolling down there, everyone says hello to each other, and she just loved that. And then we spliced them into a tour. I'm not going to show this video actually, because I just want to, just for the sake of time, but we do have a link so you can watch the video, so you can see that in the chat. So sorry, let me just whip through this here. But after we watched the tour, so what we did is we spliced all the videos of people's favorite places into a quote unquote tour, which we watched. And then after that, people used objects from their homes to design a more walkable, livable neighborhood. And you can see some of the examples here. So people mixed media too. So they used three-dimensional objects, but they also drew sketches and different things as well. And it was the perfect method for getting people into the sensing state, so then they could be creative. And then what we did was because we can't stay in these neighborhoods, we wanted to train people in advocacy so that they can be their own planning advocates. So we trained them in the different avenues for change, we called them, that they could pursue in order to realize their planning and design visions. Then we applied for a grant, and actually we received it. And what we wanted to do, because what kept coming up is people wanted a plaza, they wanted a place where they could gather. And in a lot of American cities, and going back to the first presentation, there just aren't a lot of places for gathering. There aren't a lot of green spaces that are accessible within a 10-minute walk. And so we identified an actual location where this could happen. And we did a life-size pop-up prototyping event where we had furniture, we had trees donated by the city, all sorts of life-size objects that people could move around the space to design their own plaza. And then we also prototyped the bike ped connections to the space. So we got these kind of bulb outs and colorful crosswalks and things, and put those in place so people could see how this could really improve the accessibility of the place. we documented the whole thing, and then we train people in leading their own model building workshops that they can carry on the torch. So we led them, and they're in model building workshops with them, and now they're able to do it with their friends, family, and neighbors. And again, it's just because we can't stay in these neighborhoods forever, and we really want to equip folks with the tools that they can carry on the torch, and they can be their own agents for change within their communities. And we put together a video that looks at this overall process, and there's also a link to that you guys will be able to access. The last project we're going to talk about is the Maximum Walk and Roll. So this is a project that we did through the Safe Routes Partnership. We were hired by them to engage youth in urban planning design for more walkable and rollable streets. So we put together this colorful guide, and we did a training for folks across the country who are interested in engaging youth through their hands and senses and more walkable, rollable streets. And then we made a video because we wanted to do something that was just fun and colorful that folks could watch. And this was sort of at the tail end of the pandemic as well. And so there were a lot of folks online who wanted to give them something fun and useful to watch. And the whole theme was having kids explore streets with their senses. And going back to what I was saying about how we have all this sensory knowledge inside of us, kids have this sensory knowledge too. And so the video really looks at how you can bring that sensory knowledge out of kids so that they can be their own urban planners and designers. And then we had them build models of their ideal streets for walking and rolling. And the kids, they're the perfect age because they were very unfiltered with what they said. So I'm going to show just the intro, and then if you want to watch more, there'll be a link in the chat so you can see it.
I love scooting down the street. When I'm biking, I notice trees. I don't really like running down this street. But I love running on this street.
So here's our contact info right here for James and for myself. And then there's the discount code for Dream Play Build. And yeah, I'm gonna pass it off. I'll stop the share.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, John, and thanks, James, for joining with us as well. So we'll have all of our speakers turn their cameras on so you can see them. And we've gotten a lot of questions already. We're going to go for, I guess, about 35 minutes or so with them, and that gives everybody a chance to add more questions to the queue if you want to go ahead and do that. And there we go. Okay, so as not surprisingly, a lot of the questions came in while you all were presenting, so I will ask some of the specific questions to the panelists, and then if others want to add to that answer, please do so, and we'll just keep going through here until we kind of run out of questions and or run out of time, whichever happens first. Since we have so many people today, I'm guessing that we'll have more questions in time, but we'll see. Okay, so I guess the first question we'll ask to Christina, which is from Lauren McKinney, who's asking, what qualifies as a park when determining the 10-minute walk?
That is a great question. So we do receive our data from municipal agencies as well as other partners on the ground who really ground truth the data of the parks that are accessible and nearby. We are working on defining different typologies because, of course, if you saw on a slide, a kind of more green park that's filled with different amenities and natural areas and play areas has a very different quality from an area that's perhaps just mostly asphalt or concrete or very small, or perhaps doesn't have enough access points for the public to enter that space. So for now, we have this broader definition of publicly accessible spaces that are shared in a mappable way from our municipal agencies and partners. And then our next iteration and a tool that we're looking to add to these maps is to speak to the quality aspect, because that ranges so much depending where you live.
Great, thank you. Next question here is for Anna from David Keene, who's asking, how do you prioritize missing pedestrian network links? Do you have access to data on the pedestrian network and conditions, and are people able to engage in route planning using a network map?
That is a great question. And, you know, our advocacy is statewide for the most part, and we do have worked specifically on some gaps where we've identified, you know, people we've worked with have brought to us, you know, this is a missing sidewalk for me to get from my apartment to the bus stop. But for the most part, we're sort of trying to approach things at a more statewide level. I would say that Washington State recently created an active transportation plan, which begins to look at pedestrian and bicyclist gaps on the state right-of-ways. It doesn't cover local right-of-ways, unfortunately. There's also some really exciting mapping work going on at the Tasker Center at University of Washington, where they are, Dr. Nat Cosby and others are working to create access maps that go beyond just you know, what is sort of Google walking directions that don't provide any information about the, you know, missing ramps, the slope of streets. And so they're working on a really sort of broader, more comprehensive definition of accessibility, where people could choose different factors for you know, what they need, and then plan a route based on that. But no, I mean, there's not that data. I think that would be, it's important data to get, and we are really encouraging local jurisdictions to begin some sort of analysis, so that, you know, there is, you know, beyond just a mapping, you know, where there are curb ramps, where there aren't curb ramps, which some jurisdictions don't even have that information, right? But, you know, where are there sidewalks? Where are there accessible crossings? What are the conditions of those sidewalks? We just don't have that data for the whole state at this point.
Great, thanks, Anna. Here's another question for Christina from Amy Eckberg, who's asking, what do you see as untapped opportunities to create pocket parks and green spaces other than schools? And are there any unique partnerships that you see happening in the business sector?
Those are great questions. To start with the second question, definitely working with private developers is a key partnership strategy, as well as negotiation. Of course, that looks different across cities, especially based on density and growth patterns. In places with more dense urban centers where there is land scarcity, we are leaning on these partnerships more to really create more public spaces that are privately developed, and existing private spaces to actually advocate to make them more publicly accessible. And then to the point of other underutilized spaces, we have seen great work being done where municipal agencies will partner. So for example, in Oklahoma City, they partner with their Department of Water and Utilities so that they can take those large swaths of land that are already city-owned land, naturalize them, create recreational opportunities, and also open those to the public. And then aside from that, of course, in certain contexts for those that have vacant lots and underdeveloped land areas, we are seeing ways in which to activate those. And then there are kind of smaller areas, existing community resources, like areas behind libraries or other smaller public facilities, but that are community amenities, where we're also looking to create recreational activities there as well. But the reason we shared the schoolyards experience specifically is to work with that population of school children and those are of a younger age. And then, of course, throughout the pandemic, there is this larger understanding the benefits and the needs for outdoor learning and experiences. So what we can do in terms of education outside of the classroom.
Great, thanks, Christina. Here's a question for John from Heather Miranda, who's asking, how does Placeit go through the process of converting these big ideas to implementable designs?
Yeah, we always get that question. Well, I mean, in the same way that you do with any community engagement, I think that the difference here is that you're getting to people's core values, you're getting to creative ideas that wouldn't come around otherwise. So, for example, in the project that we talk about quite a bit in the book, that was a year-long engagement process around active transportation and a livable corridor overlay. And we led folks through 3 engagement activities. So the first was hands-on model building workshop. Then we did a pop-up model to capture folks who couldn't come to the meeting, and that was outside the last remaining grocery store in the neighborhood. And then we did a sensory-based walking tour. And so what we did throughout that entire process was to gather the information that came out of those hands-on model building workshops. So the core values of the community, the creative ideas that they have, their aspirations. And none of those things were parking and traffic and no density. So people said things like trees, that was a strong recurring theme. Walking, so a lot of their memories of place had to do with walking in that neighborhood, and now a lot of people say that they can't walk in the neighborhood and they really miss that. They talked about, friends, family, neighbors, opportunity for exploration, discovery, being around nature. So these are all things that we capture at the very beginning, and then they can set the tone for all of the planning and design explorations that we do throughout the length of the process. And behind that was also going on this whole economic analysis. So we were looking at the feasibility of all these different ideas. So it's great, to have all these ideas, but then what do we need to do? Are there changes that we need to make in the zoning? Are there changes that we need to make in terms of incentivizing development, making open space, green space, plazas, those kinds of things possible? What do we need to do on a regulatory level? What do we need to change so that those things can be possible? And then, so we had this dialogue and this conversation in a kind of more proverbial sense between the engagement events and then ourselves, the planners, designers, the economic team, the city, and so on and so forth. And it really went back and forth over the course of a year. And so by the time we got to the very end and we put up all of our proposed plans, designs, drawings, zoning changes. When folks came in to look at what we had come up with, they were really excited. They saw their values reflected in what we had done, and they really felt heard. And we asked the council member at the very end, the council member of that neighborhood, why they were so positive. Because, it's very typical with planning meetings for people to be really frustrated and angry. And I think a lot of us have been to these kinds of meetings before, where people just sort of yell and scream and they hate anything that you come up with. And this was incredibly positive. Even with new housing, they were excited about the proposals for new housing. And he said, well, you listened to them and they felt heard. And so there's a huge component of this. People always ask this question, well, how do you translate all this into physical change? But there's a huge component of this that's intangible, that has to do with intangible results. And those are just as important as the tangible results. So community trust within the community, building trust between the community and the planning department and city government, increasing people's capacity to navigate these processes, instilling people a sense of hope and excitement, instilling in folks a sense that they can be their own designers and planners. These are all things that are just as important as the tangible outcomes that come out of these processes that we use. And so we really like to say that it's the two and that go hand in hand. And because those intangibles are going to outlive the process that we lead folks through. So anyways, I hope that helps answer your question. And James is back, so James had an issue with the connection there, the Wi-Fi there. So anyways, I don't know if you want to add anything, Jimmy. Okay.
Great, thank you. Well, we'll just keep going on with the questions, and thanks for joining us, James. Here's another question for Anna from Steve Mahawald, who's asking, can you speak to what degree you've looked at improving the pedestrian environment by changing code requirements? For example, any new residential development requires sidewalks.
Yes, definitely. I mean, yeah, the sidewalk piece is a huge issue, right? And we do, you know, in Washington State, that is a requirement, right? With new developments. I think our challenge is, what do we do to retrofit existing places where sidewalks weren't built, or where sidewalks have been built but then haven't been maintained? And so right now we are doing a deep dive with sidewalks. And Tanisha, who you heard in that video, she's working with me in the city of Seattle to figure out, are there things we can do to either actually begin to ask property owners to maintain the sidewalks in front of their properties, or can we explore models more like what they've done in Oakland with a point of sale ordinance? When that property is sold, the sidewalks need to be brought up to code, or what they're doing in Denver, or maybe are doing in Denver, where they're going, you know, to the ballot for a levy for public maintenance of sidewalks. And so I think, you know, big picture, we would love to see sidewalks have the same priority and the same public resources and maintained publicly the way our roadways are. They are part of the public right of way, but we're trying to figure out the best strategic way to get there. Because right now, at least in the city of Seattle, there's absolutely no enforcement of or expectation that property owners really are maintaining their sidewalks. The city has gone around and done some beveling and shimming as sort of a stopgap measure at some of the worst uplifts, but it doesn't get us there. And it's really disappointing in a city, especially like Seattle, where there's so much wealth, that we can't have a walkable, rollable pedestrian network where we have sidewalks.
Great, thanks, Anna. Next question here is from Dwayne Martinez, who says, for John, James, and maybe Anna, what are your best strategies for reaching hard to reach or unique populations in cities to boost their participation, such as non-drivers, non-English speakers, and so on?
We do a lot of we do a lot of workshops or pop-ups in laundromats, mercados, swap meets, flea markets, wherever people gather, we can go and follow them and kind of engage them in planning issues, because we're using these really hands-on methods. So that's where we can really target people. And we're doing workshops all in Spanish and different, so it really gets them engaged. And for a lot of Latinos, they come to the workshop because they want to hear about their neighbor stories. So we'll have repeat people coming to the workshops because they want to be part of this whole collective and tell their story. So we just go where people are and kind of bring them the right tools to get them to engage with us.
Yeah, and then I think one thing I'll add too about reaching folks whose first language maybe isn't English is that because we're engaging people through their hands and their senses, and in particular with the model building workshops, people are able to use the objects as a way to jog their memory if they can't remember a word. They're able to point to objects if they can't remember something. And then what I was talking about during the presentation about eyes being on people and how it makes people nervous. The other strength of these workshops is that everyone's eyes are on the model and on your hands, and they're not on you. So it takes a lot of pressure off of the person who's speaking, so they don't feel so put on the spot. And we get the question all the time about translation, and do we need to have a translator at the meeting? And oftentimes, honestly, more often than not, we might have a translator, but then they barely do anything, because the hands-on nature of the medium just allows people who don't have a perfect grasp of English to still express themselves. Another interesting thing that came up too once recently is we had headsets for folks whose first language wasn't English, but they didn't want to wear them because they didn't want to be outside of the group. They wanted to be a part of the main group. And so then the same thing happened, we just, because they were able to use the objects, they were really able to express themselves. And then if they were stuck at all, there would be someone there who could help translate a little bit. But it's just something to think about when it comes to group dynamic and belonging.
I can jump in real quick too. I think, our best work has happened because we've been hiring folks like you heard Crystal and Abby in the video, both spent a lot of time working with me as organizers. And so they were able to reach out to their own networks of other disabled folks that they were in touch with. And then we've also done some incredible outreach with community organizations who aren't, traditionally thinking of themselves as disability organizations, but do community work with low-income communities and communities of color. Latino Community Fund here in Seattle, and then Living Well Kent works a lot with Iraqi and Afghani immigrants. And it's been really, really wonderful to be able to use, help them reach out to the folks they work with about transportation access and hear some of those stories. That's been amazing.
Yeah, we did a good project. We did a project with Phoenix, Arizona, people with disabilities, where the city built this facility for them. Across the street was a rail line, but no rail stop. So I did a workshop with 30 people with disabilities and told them, build your ideal station based on their disability. And they did. They shared it with each other. And they were so excited that for 5 years, they lobbied the city of Phoenix to get them a rail station built. Now the 50th Street station served their center, and they use it every day. But that would be from their own advocacy and kind of really tapping into their needs and turning their needs into a solution that they can go advocate for. So now it's a really beautiful station with shade and everything that they asked for.
Okay, thanks, James. Our next question here is from Nicole Bennett, who's asking or saying first, I work with equity metrics, and I think this is generally for everyone. Are you finding that the types of issues you've pointed out with walkability and rollability are being included in the evaluation criteria to prioritize transportation and mobility projects?
I can jump in real quick. This is Anna. I think one thing that we found is really interesting is traditionally when people are trying to figure out who has access to vehicles, because of the way that the American Community Survey works, you can measure, vehicles per household, but there's no really way of understanding the nuance of who within that household has access to that vehicle. So if that household includes disabled people who can't drive, or say it's a household where one partner takes the car to work and the other partner doesn't have access at all, there's no really nuance of understanding those dynamics. And so that's something I would be really interested in having more information about, because right now there's not a way to map access to vehicles within a household.
Yeah, and the work, we do a lot of work on Latino urbanism, the way Latinos use space, and what's the relationship walking on the street as a Latino to that space, and what kind of things do they create to make walking more palatable in places like LA that are car culture. They'll put street vendors, they have street vendors, and they have all the different things that they do themselves to make walking a lot more palatable. So really thinking about how different community groups really actually walk and what walking means to them. And for them, it's just a journey and not necessarily going from point A to point B, but really kind of shifting that kind of knowledge about how we think about transportation.
I can share one specific example that we're working on now. And in the past, we've typically worked with kind of bike activist groups to help us map out and ground truth access trail points and access to parks. But right now in Scranton, we're working both with community groups and the city for volunteers and also community organizers to just assess the quality of the sidewalks and the streetscape and the intersections around the parks, and advocating for more safe and accessible crossings. And within that, the city prioritized like 6 to 10 parks for that based on equity metrics. But in terms of co-locating transit or prioritizing a sidewalk and being able to direct funds there, we aren't quite yet, but we're in kind of that pre-step for making the case for making those areas more safe and accessible, especially if we see high park usage and pedestrian traffic at those intersections.
Great, thanks, Christina. Oh, go ahead. You can.
Sorry, I just
Go
want to
ahead.
jump in with one other sort of equity metric that I think is, how people identify or not as disabled, I think is super interesting, and something we've seen in our interviews where there's just different cultural norms, there's different generations comfort with identifying as disabled, and people may have very similar access needs, but identify very differently. And so I think, in asking questions about disability, it's important to be aware of those differences, because someone may be really comfortable identifying as disabled, while someone else with a different cultural background, just doesn't feel like that's an identity that fits them, even though they have the same access needs.
Great, thanks, Anna. Next question is for Christina from Vera Orzransky, who's asking, can you speak more about how informal community leaders are identified and engaged, and how you partner with them? And if they are paid for their work, how do those contracts work?
That is a great question. So one example that I can pull is from Chattanooga, Tennessee, where we have a park listeners program. So those are residents that are in the neighborhood, and whether they are a community leader in terms of take the sense of belonging and leadership that they have within the community, or quote unquote formal part of a coalition or an organization, or a group that is has some kind of decision-making power. There are those many various distinctions that exist, honestly, and it's quite diverse. But through the Park Listener program, the objective is to really call on really different identities and different users to understand the quality of neighborhood parks in their area in Chattanooga. With that, I don't know the details of that program specifically, but in many of our TPL offices, they look to compensate community leaders directly through this work, and also having a budget to do that, and also working with city practitioners to better understand what funds are available for community engagement specifically. I know that in Baltimore, they had shared with us they were able to use their all the funds that were used for their capital improvement projects, so to go through renovations and construction for actual parks. Those parks were much larger, and smaller neighborhood community parks weren't eligible for these types of funds. So with that, they dedicated more funds for community engagement and programming, and working with folks who live in that neighborhood and directing funds to that instead, because they didn't go through capital improvements. But yes, there are many different examples. I don't think that across the board it's a general practice in which every city is able to compensate community members and leaders for their time. But luckily at TPL, with many of our offices, they are able to budget for that and invest in that type of resource, and building community trust specifically.
Thanks, Christina. Our next question here is from Lauren McKinney, who is asking John or James, I love the idea of building trust between city government and the community, but do you ever struggle with getting governments on board with workshops?
Yeah, earlier on it was harder, but people who work in city planning departments, for example, anyone who does any sort of community engagement on the inside, they're sick of bad community meetings too. So it's not like they love having these meetings and having the same 4 people come to the meetings and dominate and yell and scream at them and say the same things about parking, traffic, and density. So they are increasingly looking for ways of doing things differently. They know that what's been done heretofore hasn't worked. And so what we've started to find is a lot of smaller cities that can be a bit more nimble with how they do things. They're not so constrained by large bureaucracy. They've been approaching us, and so increasingly we've been working with a lot of cities. And earlier on in our work, we didn't work with cities as much. We worked more with like arts organizations and nonprofits and things like that. But now we're working with cities like the city of Tempe, the city of Anaheim, the city of Raleigh, all sorts of cities around the country who are like, look, we have to do something differently. Now, that being said, there's still, because the nature of the engagement is so different, the medium of engagement is so different from what they're used to, there is a sort of walking through that you might need to do with folks, and that we've had to do with certain cities. So we'll do like a mock workshop with staff before we do the actual workshop so they can get a sense of how it will actually work. Because there's also a lot of fear. It's not just that people are saturated with how poorly community meetings go, but there's also a fear too that they're going to be hijacked by one or two people who are just going to ruin the whole thing. And so we've had instances where we've already gotten the job, so we've already signed the contract, but the city will still be kind of worried about this process. Oh, I don't know how this is going to work, and they'll tell us, there are these 3 people who always show up. Just to give you a heads up, they're going to show up and they're going to make your life miserable. So we're going to have to figure out a strategy for making sure that they don't dominate. But invariably what ends up happening because of the medium, because it really disarms people, because of what I was talking about brain activity, people are working with their hands, they're working with their senses, they're not in survival mode. So that kind of disarming that the city wants us to do is it ends up happening in a very soft way, where we're not saying, no, you can't do that. We're saying, here's what we're all going to do, and you're going to participate and you're going to love it because it's fun. That's the other thing about everything we do. It's all rooted in play and having fun. And that's kind of a side conversation, but a lot of what we do as well in terms of pitching our work is that play and fun are not antithetical to generating meaningful and useful outcomes. They can actually be a really effective way of bringing a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't participate into the process, and then you can generate really meaningful outcomes about walkability and equity and rollability and so on and so forth. So what ends up happening, even when folks will say, well, we're worried about these people and that they're going to dominate, is that they don't end up dominating. Right, so the medium disarms them, and then we just don't have that dynamic. And we'll set aside time sometimes at the end of a workshop if folks have sort of outstanding issues, they want to air out some dirty laundry, vent, whatever it is. But honestly, a lot of times by that time, people are in such good moods and they're in such a mental zone, that sensing state that I was talking about. They feel like a sense of possibility, a sense of lightness, all of these different things, that when we get to that part at the end, they don't want to complain anymore, because they feel like they've been heard and they feel like, okay, yes, I'm part of this process, and moving forward, my ideas, my values are going to be woven into the overall project. But as a final thing, I'll say with larger cities, it can be challenging. I mean, I think that there's just so much bureaucracy to contend with and so much protocol that's kind of in place. And so we've just been working with a lot of smaller cities. Not that we don't want to work with larger cities, but that's just been the recurring theme for us.
Great, thanks, John. And John and James joined us earlier this year in February for a Smart Growth Network webinar that just focused on their book. And we're going to copy in the chat a link to that for those who want to take a look at that. We're getting a lot of questions, I think, that we answered last time. And given the time constraints, I think we'll just post that link so folks can look at what you've presented previously. But I'll move on to the next question here from Eric Smith, who's asking, I guess, Christina, new parks are great, but shouldn't the city or community maintain and repair old and broken sidewalks before investing in additional infrastructure?
That is a great point, and that is the uphill battle that we definitely work upon, which is having enough of a budget for maintenance and operations and stewardship. I apologize, I forget which speaker had mentioned the maintenance funding before. Actually, I believe it was Anna in Denver. That is one place where we have been able to have a successful bond measure to fund operations and maintenance for parks and recreation. And that is a model that we're really looking to do in other places. It's just that, of course, funding is so unique based on state and local levels. But absolutely, the focus isn't just new development. If you think of the 10-minute walk access and the different priority points that they show on a map, it's to direct investments in those areas where there is a park need. But then when you look at the park acreage metric, which I hope was useful before, to show where there are folks who have less space, and if you actually go to that neighborhood, seeing the conditions of the connectivity to that area, but also the park itself. That is really where we're looking to provide more data to tell more of that story of the park experience. So with that, as I mentioned before, with some of the cities, we're in that kind of pre-stage. We're not quite in the stage of being able to unlock funding for all of those types of projects. But it's been really exciting to be working with cities on how to map those experiences as a starting point, to really make the case to see the funds that are out there, to really direct it to the existing parks. And I don't even mean, you know, existing large parks, kind of the pocket parks and neighborhood parks, the community areas that folks have close by to home.
Great, thanks, Christina. So we've gotten a few questions in this realm regarding gentrification. So let me ask this one in particular, and it's for all the panelists. Incrementally improving infrastructure for active transportation, micromobility, or parkland access can inevitably lead to gentrification in older communities. Are there strategies we can use to mitigate against it?
I'll step in. I think our approach is to always start our meetings with having everybody build their favorite childhood memory of a place. Therefore, that memory, that story, becomes embedded in the start of the process. So we're not starting from this blank slate. We're starting from stories and memories that people have of the existing place. So people will kind of fill in the blanks, because as outsiders in the communities, all we see are the physical infrastructure, but the residents carry the stories around their head. And those are just as important as infrastructure. So having especially stories is really important. You know, for example, I grew up in Los Angeles, and my grandparents, my parents always rode the streetcars. You know, they were Latino, low income, they were streetcars, but then the city just took them away because they wanted to put more cars in the street. So me as a person, I have the stories that are embedded in me, and that's why I became a transportation pundit in Los Angeles, trying to rebuild the streetcars. So memory can be a really powerful place in really kind of uplift people's stories and really fighting, at least getting developments right, so you don't have displacement or gentrification.
This is Anna. I can jump in. I think, you know, in the interviews that we've done throughout Washington, the cost of housing and people's inability to afford or continue to afford to live in places where there is some semblance of sidewalk connectivity, or there is, you know, frequent or reliable transit, that's a huge barrier. And we hear that over and over again of people being unable to afford, you know, housing in these denser areas, and moving further out to the suburbs, to the exurbs, back home with family in rural areas where they lose all transportation access and have to rely completely on friends and family. And so, yeah, it's a huge issue, and something that we talk about a lot with how can we reform zoning? How can we make it so that there can be more affordable housing for low income folks on SSI, who, you know, near transit and near places where there is a sidewalk, because right now that's increasingly unaffordable.
Great, thank you.
Go
ahead. Go ahead, John.
Good. Yeah, you know, this is a good question, and in the book, I literally wrote, we don't have the silver bullet on solving the gentrification issue. I don't think anyone does at this point. You know, we're living in a time of such rapid change in cities, and you know, cities have gone from being, American cities have gone from being very undervalued to very overvalued and very expensive very quickly. But what I will say, regardless of this sort of overall observation, a few things about the work that we've done and some things that we've heard and noticed with the neighborhood that we worked with in South Colton, which is the kind of narrative arc of the book. At the very end, I talked earlier about the final meeting we had where we presented the designs and zoning changes and housing that we had proposed and how everyone was really on board with everything. And it was going to make the neighborhood nicer. And so this is a neighborhood that's been neglected for years. It's had a very bad hand dealt to it. And the folks there said, we want this. We want change. We want things to be better. We want the things that the communities around us have. So I offer that up because I think it's important to keep that in mind. That there's in the big cities in Los Angeles and San Francisco and these places where there's just so much investment and there's been investment. The discourse on gentrification is very different from how it is in a place like South Colton, where they're like, we really want change. We just want nice things. And I think that's true of a lot of neighborhoods. And then that leads to this broader question. If that's the reality, then how do we get there? How do we make it so that folks can have the walkable streets, they can have the plazas, they can have the cafes, all the things that these folks in this neighborhood want, and still be able to live there, right? I think that's a big challenge for us moving forward in cities. The neighborhood that James and I live in Oakland, it's really walkable. It's great. The streets are narrow. There's a train station really close by. We can walk to get our groceries. It's a no-brainer. It's like you wouldn't drive to get your groceries and you wouldn't drive to all these different places here. But the houses in this neighborhood, we're not homeowners. We live in a rent-controlled apartment that's 350 square feet. But the houses of this neighborhood are going for $2 million. That's a problem to me on multiple levels, but partly because walkability shouldn't be something that's only allowed for rich people, right? This has to be something that everyone has access to. But over time, we've created these cities with pockets of walkability and then just massive amounts of sprawl and unwalkability. And a lot of what I think about now is just retrofitting. Like, how are we going to, and what Christina and Anna have been talking about, how do we retrofit these places that were never designed to be walkable? But that's a challenge that we really need to take on.
And I really don't have much to add because our speakers here just have shared the topic so articulately. But it's a question that we receive from our cities, small or large, also towns, suburban areas, rural areas, about tackling this issue. And I think that we're always looking for examples in which, kind of going back to what Anna was saying, where affordable housing developments, when those are being built, what are their community amenity requirements? And oftentimes, because of the issue of land scarcity, parks and green spaces are not included, or if parks and public spaces are included, the accessibility point, it still seems private to the rest of the public. So there's also that issue too. So I guess kind of going back to the first question that was asked by the audience, it's really also just entering this territory of building so many more relationships with the developer world, with private developers, better understanding those strategies and what cities can better require, so that it isn't always going back to fix what has already happened, because we all know how much longer that it takes. So yeah, I don't have much added to that, but just to echo that this is a question that city practitioners are asking us and we're asking back. So it does really seem to be a cyclical conversation, but kind of what John had said, I really don't believe that there's a silver bullet, but I think there are a lot of really interesting ways to approach it.
Great, thanks, Christina. We're going to just ask a couple more. I know we're a little over on time, but we've gotten many questions, and I just want to get a couple more in before we close. And thanks to everybody who's still with us. We still have more than 700 people here. And the next question here is from Anita Yankee, who's asking, are any of you doing work to integrate walkability with social determinants of health?
I can just jump in. There was a link shared earlier for City Health 2.0, which is a green space policy package, and it's a partner that we work with. We are really advocating for a 10-minute walk to a park to be a part of the built environment as a key indicator for mental, physical, and emotional health. There you can see the way different cities rank. I think it's a really useful tool almost as a database to see which cities are implementing this type of language and actually codifying it in terms of health determinants, and which cities are still aspiring to do that type of work. But I would point to that as a really useful resource. And at TPL, we're very lucky to have a director of public health to really kind of, from a measures and evaluation standpoint, to have that really acute health lens in our parks and green spaces work.
This is a little bit adjacent, perhaps, not directly social determinants of health, but one of our collaborations is with Front and Centered, which is a BIPOC-led mobility, environmental justice organization here in Washington State. And we work with them a lot on discussing, how freeways and how high-speed roads not only create access barriers for non-drivers, but also create public health consequences for the communities that they go through, and how those communities have, often are the historically redlined communities or rural communities where there's a lot of immigrant farm workers. And so that's a collaboration that we really value, and allows us to talk broader than just accessibility, and connect our work to environmental justice, to public health, and then to climate work as well.
Great, thank you. I guess here's a comment from Michael Zarnik for you all to respond to. And he's saying, it absolutely amazes me at how much money we spend making for a smooth roadway for motor vehicles with large rubber tires, yet for the small wheels of mobility devices and for people using small wheels to travel, we make it an extreme challenge and disregard the smooth roadway to travel. Maybe Anna, you want to respond to that based on your work?
Oh my gosh, yes. I just right ahead way I thought about this woman who I met on a bus here in Seattle, who used a walker, and the sidewalks along Rainier, which is the street I was talking about earlier, are so torn up that she had gone through 2 walkers in the last 2 years because the little wheels had just broken off. And that was a big expense for her. And yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, aside from the fact, just a user group I would love to throw in there is just caregivers, like walking with dependents. And when you're kind of peripheral vision is of course occupied by walking with someone else or taking care of someone else, or whether that be a stroller. That's why I really loved, Anna, your comment before, like what is considered or identified as a disability or how that's categorized on a personal level. I feel like that also applies to folks who are completely able-bodied, but if you're carrying a ton of things, if you're walking with an older person, if you're walking with a child caring for another, it kind of makes the experience a bit more universal, to the point in the chat of why we need a walkable pathway to get to places.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, and this is something I actually ended the book with as kind of a parting thought, and kind of a hope for urban planning in the 21st century. Historically, urban planning has really been about regulating the private realm. And that's really the purview of urban planners, and I mean like urban planners who work for cities, but also on the private sector too, because they're making recommendations for cities. But they're really overseeing what happens within the private realm. And the private realm affects the public realm. It affects the experience along the sidewalk. But there's only so much you can do within the private realm to make the public realm more pleasant. And I really hope that cities moving forward that planning departments can start to have more jurisdiction, oversight, and power over the public realm, over our sidewalks, over our streets, that it's not just traffic engineers who have the oversight of these spaces and places, because the metrics that they're looking at are a lot of times completely different than from the metrics that we're looking at, and that really are important and really obviously very relevant to everything we've talked about today. And so, just something very simple, like historically in a lot of cities, streets have been widened and sidewalks have been narrowed. And that's a practice that still happens. So we build large buildings, and then in order to quote unquote mitigate traffic, we widen the street and we narrow the sidewalk. So suddenly all these people living in this building, their front yard is a 5-foot wide sidewalk and an 80-foot wide roadway. So first of all, I mean, that obviously needs to change, and it is slowly, but at the very minimum, the sidewalk needs to stay as is. But I think that we need to push even further and say, no, actually, the sidewalk needs to be wider and the roadway needs to be narrower. And I don't think that that should be seen as anything radical at this point in time. Like, more and more people are living in small spaces. They don't have access to a lot of green space. They don't have access to a lot of parks. The sidewalk sometimes is going to be that public space that they have immediate access to. And so we really need to start, when we put a new development in or we're retrofitting something, it needs to be, we're going to make the sidewalk wider and we're going to make the 80-foot roadway 60 feet or something like that. I just think that that's the direction that we need to be going in, and then we have more space for greenery, for trees, tackling the heat island effect, thinking about climate change. Yeah, that's my kind of parting hope, wish, thought, sort of rah, let's go for it.
Yeah, in Los Angeles, they're supposed to theoretically, when they repave the street, is fix the sidewalk. But they've never done that, because the sidewalks are this kind of contested space between the homeowner and the city. Who fixes it? Who pays for that cost? It's not really clear, and it kind of varies from city to city. So the roads get paved and the sidewalks stay broken. And that's just the way it's been for a long time. So yeah, it's a big kind of a policy and real estate mess.
Thanks, James, and everybody. So we've run out of time here, and as always, we always get more questions than we have time for. So we'll share everything we got with all the panelists, as well as you've seen their contact information on the screen. We just wanted to give, I guess, everybody one last chance to give us some closing thoughts here, and we'll start with Christina.
No, just a thank you to being on this panel. It was so wonderful to meet these speakers and to get these great questions from the audience. And I just really encourage everyone to use these data tools that we have. The point is, yes, we're using this to make the case for decision makers, but the case comes from people. So we are always looking for feedback also on how these advocacy tools could be better displayed and more user-friendly for communities. So I just want to say, please play around with them. Put in your city or town, see if the data is correct. If it says there's a park there and there isn't, report it back to us. We're always looking for user feedback. And yeah, thank you for the invitation today.
Great, thanks, Christina. We'll let Anna go next.
Great, awesome. Yeah, thank you all. Again, wonderful to meet everyone. And yeah, I just want to jump off what James was saying around sidewalks and, not getting repaired when the roadways do. And the funny thing is, what we see a lot here, right, is that, because of the ADA, if a road gets repaved, they'll sometimes put in curb ramps, and then those curb ramps will be curb ramps to nowhere, right? There will be no sidewalk, or the sidewalk will be completely inaccessible. And I just want to, point out that for disabled folks, sidewalks really are critical, and for non-drivers, for all communities, but especially for folks who don't have the privilege of being able to hop in a vehicle and drive where they need to go. These sidewalks are a critical piece of connectivity. I think it was Jimin, one of the advocates we work with from Port Orchard, Washington, said sidewalks are our highways. And I think I'll just leave you with that the access and connectivity of those sidewalks is absolutely critical. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And I guess we'll end with John and James. I don't know, John, if you want to add more to what you said, or have James finish.
Yeah, James can. I feel like what I said was kind of my parting thought, my call to action.
Yeah. Well, I think we should make sidewalks and walkability aspirational, so everybody wants this and needs this. So we need to really change how we engage people on mobility. So just make it part of their body, part of the lived experience, part of the memory, part of the aspiration and identity. That's going to really kind of move us, because we can't move forward without them to get them charged to move forward. That's it.
Great. Thanks. Well, thanks, James, and thanks everybody for being with us today. We are going to post all of the links that were shared in the chat from the presenters on our webinar archive page with the recording once it's processed. So you'll be able to find everything there if you weren't able to take notes from this. So with that, we're going to conclude our webinar, Equity and Walkability, Improving Pedestrian Infrastructure in Underserved Neighborhoods. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to Christina Yang, Anna Zevarts, John Camp, and James Rojas for a great presentation, to everyone who attended today, and to John Coleman, our communications guru, who helps to make this all happen every single time. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those of you who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email if you need the certificate to claim other continuing education credits. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. And finally, keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars, including the essential value of street trees in city making and sustainable urban design with Dan Burden and Victor Dover, which is going to be on next Monday, October 17th. The third Walkinar will be next Thursday, Walking and Public Health, Research Insights into the Value of Active Living. And then the final Walktober Walkinar will be on October 27th. With that, I wish everyone a great day and thanks for being with us.